Welcome to another episode of the P&R Churchman. Today we're talking Christian ethics. And so I have today Ruling Elder Scott Hatch. He's the author of this new book, Van Til and the Foundation of Christian Ethics, a God-centered approach to moral philosophy. And this is published by Reformed Forum. So I'm excited to have this conversation. Christian ethics is a topic that is very relevant to today, how we live out what we believe in the real world. And we see a lot of Christians capitulating on this, compromising on this, and it starts with what is their foundation for Christian ethics. And so this will be a great conversation. Scott, thanks for being on.
It's great being here.
Yes. So tell us about yourself, where you serve, how long you've been a ruling elder, a little bit about your family, if you like, anything to help us get to know a little bit about you.
Sure. Just a little bit of background, because it is actually relevant to the whole discussion of ethics. I grew up in a Navy family in a United Methodist Church back in the 1980s, so in the post-Vietnam era. Most of what I was hearing in church was more the social gospel than the real gospel. And when I was in high school, the pastor, he retired. His wife was my Sunday school teacher. She was a godly woman, even though we disagreed on politics, social issues, and all of that. But the pastor had divorced his wife in order to marry one of my school teachers. So when I went to college, I was like, Jesus, yes, church, no way.
Wow.
And then I basically had a crisis of faith in about 1988. Coming through that, I was like, I need to get back to church. And so I started going to a Baptist church, and I moved down to this area to take a job with the government.
Where is that? Did you say that already, where you live?
Been in the Northern Virginia area pretty much since 1990.
Okay.
Moved in with a colleague of mine who is Eastern Orthodox. So I flirted for a time with actually converting to Eastern Orthodoxy. But I had been reading stuff by Michael Horton and J.I. Packer. And through God's providence, I was brought to McLean Presbyterian Church here in this area. And that's really kind of when I first joined the PCA, was when I joined McLean Pres.
Okay. What year was that?
That would have been 1993, 1994.
Okay.
So because I was working international relations, I was like, I need to, if I'm going to be working in this field, I need to be in dealing with other worldviews. I need to be grounded in my own worldview. So that started a process of, I ended up going to Reformed Theological Seminary here in D.C. for a number of years.
Wait a minute. I didn't even know. So RTS has a D.C. campus?
They have a D.C. campus, yeah.
Okay.
I can say I was one of the plank holders because when they started it was at one of the churches in the area, Fourth Presbyterian Church. So I remember, go back to the days when we were meeting in like a trailer outside the church. So I got a master's in religion there, but God was still working on my heart. And it's like, okay, this is not just for worldview. This is life. This is ministry. Is God calling me to something more? You know, I've wrestled with that. And I figured I needed, however I answered that question, I need to go back and get grounding in the languages, in Hebrew and Greek. That's where I met the pastor of my current church, Porter Harlow. I'm at a Christ Presbyterian Church. When Porter
had he planted that church yet when you met him?
When I met him, no. He was finishing up a career in the military, and he had worked it so that he could get his last tour of duty in the D.C. area so that he could go to seminary. And he had a heart for wanting to plant a church in the D.C. area. So when Porter was like, I want to start a small church plant, my wife and I thought about it, and we were like, yeah, we want to do this. So...
Were you an RE at the time?
I was a deacon at McLean, and so when Porter started the church, we just moved over, and the church, Christ Presbyterian Church of Burke, started in 2019. So I had gone back to seminary part-time to get my THM from Westminster. The book that we're going to be talking about is a conversion of my THM thesis at Westminster.
Right. So what years were you at Westminster?
Went to Westminster from 2015 to 2019.
Did you know David Filson?
Yep. I didn't have any classes with him, but I know who he is.
Yeah, I mean he's big into Van Til. I take courses at Birmingham Theological Seminary in a D-Min and apologetics program, and I've had David, who teaches as an adjunct there, and I know he got to do. It sounds like a lot of what you got to do, which was pour over like handwritten notes and syllabi by Van Til, and some really cool stuff that you had access to. So yeah, so. Your wife is a part of this story, how you even started to want to write on the ethics of Van Til. Is that right? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, very much so. In fact, I would be in trouble if I didn't mention her.
So explain that, because as I was reading that in either the preface or the first chapter, I was like, man, she was reading some heady stuff for like a discipleship group.
She was being discipled back in the 1990s by a Filipino-American gentleman who had gone to Chesapeake Theological Seminary. And so that's how she got exposed to Van Til. Now, how I got into all of this stuff, I read Van Til a little bit when I was taking classes at Chesapeake. But when I was at McLean, I was teaching a kind of largish Sunday school class. And we were going through the Old Testament, so we were actually covering 1 Samuel 21, which, if you recall, is that chapter where David is fleeing from Saul. He goes to Nob. He is not entirely honest about what he tells the priest at Nob. I mean, it's a fascinating chapter. I could talk more about that. We had a really heated discussion within the Sunday school class over that. And so I had folks coming up to me afterwards saying, have you read John Murray? I'm like, well, no, hadn't read John Murray's Principles of Conduct when I was in seminary. So you have to read John Murray. Okay, fine, I'll read John Murray. And so I figured, okay, I'm just going to do a deep dive on ethics. So I had Oliver O'Donovan's Resurrection and the Moral Order that I had from seminary. I had John Frame's Doctrine of the Christian Life. I figured, okay, I got to read Murray. I'll read Murray. And Van Til's Christian Theistic Ethics, my wife had. So I'm like, well, it's short. It seems to be clear. I'll throw that on the stack as well. And then I'll be done. Because honestly, and this is one of the things that surprises even me about how God has used this. If you told me 10 years ago that I'd be writing a book on ethics, I would have kind of looked at you strangely. Like, ethics? No. Because my exposure to ethics is, here's an abstract idea, here's an abstract value, they clash, oh, isn't life complex? Go figure it out. I'm like, well, that's useless.
Well, it's funny you're saying that, because probably 10 years ago now, maybe more, when I was in seminary and I had to take a class on ethics, first I was surprised it was in the systematic theology curriculum and department. But second, I was like, I know the law of God. And then I took the class, and it became one of my favorite classes, because I'm like, oh yeah, this is not simply just where rubber meets the road. It is, there is a systematic way to understand this. And, the 1 Samuel passage you mentioned is fascinating, because there's layers to the ethical dilemmas. Like you said, David lies to the priest. Did the priest know he was lying? And yet, then the priest allows him to do what the law says should not be done. And of course, Christ uses this as an example in the New Testament. So it's so deep, but it's in the same category of like, Rahab lying to, about the spies, or the midwives in Exodus, lying to Pharaoh. And then there's questions, well, did they lie? And so ethical dilemma really much is a fascinating area of practical theology that is it's complicated, and yet it's not as complicated as we make it if we have the right foundation, right?
Yeah. And I don't think I had the right foundation until I started wrestling with this.
Right.
And so, I threw Van Til's book on the stack. And what I found as I was reading it, I was like, this is very different. This is not like any of the other books. You know, most of the books that you get on ethics, I'm generalizing here, I'm sure there are exceptions, but most of the books will talk, here are some sources, you know, you can, of ethics. You know, you can get your ethics from the Bible or philosophy or what have you. But really, when you're talking about ethics, you're making a lot of assumptions about the nature of God, the nature of reality, the nature of man, the interaction of man and God, man's will in relation to God's will. I mean, there's a lot. That's why it's in systematic theology.
And how we know. I mean,
and how we know
is, which is, I know, is an important part of your work. I mean, absolutely. So,
Van Til talks about, I think it's in Defense of the Faith, he talks about 3 areas of philosophy, and I think religion hits all of those areas as well. Metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And, okay, those are big words. What do they mean? Metaphysics is, what do we understand about reality? Epistemology is, how do we understand? How do we know what we know? And then ethics flows from that. How we understand reality, how we apprehend that understanding, feeds into how we then live. And so when I got to Westminster, you have for a THM program, you have to come up with a thesis statement. And I was like wrestling with different issues. I was like, well, I couldn't think of a good way of framing a research question on other things other than this. And so I was like, okay, I'll put that down, and then I can change the thesis if I wanted to do something different once I got in there. Once I got to Westminster, it's like, okay, it's dawned on me, this is a seminary that is found, you know, not foundational, but it's the key guys that can be studied there. Machen, Gerhardus Voss, Cornelius Van Til, Dick Gaffin, Meredith Klein. You know, these are all core to Westminster. So I should pick one and just focus on that. And that brought me back to Van Til. So I started thinking about the thesis in terms of the classes that I was taking there. And actually used one of the classes to work through some of the issues that were at the core of this book about Van Til's approach to ethics. So a little bit of story here. You know, I reached out to one of the archivist at Westminster, and I said, well, he has this syllabus. When did he teach ethics? And my assumption was he taught it for a few years and then turned it over to John Murray, who had a book on this, so John Murray must have been the lead guy on ethics. And the archivist came back and said he never turned it over to Murray. He taught ethics for the better part of 30 years at Westminster. In fact, after World War II, or as World War II was beginning, the ethics program actually expanded. So Van Til taught the first semester, which would essentially be a foundations in ethics. It wasn't called that, but that's what it was. And then Murray would teach the second semester, and that lasted pretty much up through the end of the 1950s. So, yeah, that was a surprise. So I figured, okay, there's something more here. He's taught this for 30 years.
Right. So let's talk about the surprise for a second, just for listeners who aren't familiar with Van Til. Van Til is often complex to read because, well, he's just brilliant, but he often creates his own terms, defines his own terms, and then uses them, and you just really have to have some background there. But Van Til is mostly known for apologetics, and particularly what has come to be known as presuppositional apologetics. And so when people hear Van Til, they're thinking of an apologist. But when you actually read Van Til, his apologetics is all based on, in my understanding, and I'm not a Van Til expert by any stretch of the imagination, but is based on a reformed epistemology, how we know and can know what we know. And so it always made sense to me that he was very much speaking about ethics, but I never really seen anything on his ethical on his ethical system. In other words, as much as he's talking about apologetics, how do we communicate the truths of God to people to convince them? It's the same foundation by which then how do we live? Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, your book, because I've read not the whole thing because I just got it right before the weekend, but it very much is introducing me to what I naturally in my reading of Van Til assumed should be there. And so I appreciate that. And so was that part of what you said as like sort of this surprise that he has written on ethics? And not only that, it undergirded a lot of his work.
Yeah. Well, there was two surprises. I just mentioned one, that he had taught it as long as he did. The second surprise, when I started focusing on the thesis, I went back to the archivist, and a different archivist at this time, and just said, is there anything else in the archives just so that I can flesh this out? And he said, oh, I found this whole conservaphile thing on Van Til ethics. Do you think that would be relevant? And I said, yeah, I think that'd be very relevant. And so what I found in there was the original syllabus that he had, which is now reprinted for the first time in one of the appendices of my book. And then he also had revised that greatly in about 1941. And so...
Is that different than because you reference a 1970 syllabus, but that one's not in the appendixes.
Yeah, basically he did a revision in 1941, cut back that revision a bit in 1947 and added some new stuff in. And then I think in the early 1960s, he was looking at probably a graduate level seminar on ethics, which I don't think ever got taught. And so the 1970 version that you can buy from Amazon and elsewhere is really kind of, he's just putting together his final version of things. And so I think if you look at the 1970 version of Christian theistic ethics, it's divided into two parts.
Is that the book your wife had?
That's the book my wife had.
Gotcha. Okay.
So part one is really the syllabus that he used for the better part of 30 years as it had evolved. Part two is what I think was the graduate level seminar stuff that I don't think was ever taught. And so, this was an optic on both seeing how Van Til's thought changed over time. But I felt with this discovery, putting it all together into what is effectively a critical edition, so to speak, allowed me I needed to put that into context of why did the changes happen when they happened? What was going on with Van Til? And that, I think, also illuminates some of the practical aspects of this, because in the 1930s, Van Til becomes a professor at Westminster. He, I think, is just given, hey, we need a class on ethics, you write it up. So probably writes it up in the fall of 29, teaches it in the spring of 1930. Does that for the better part of 10 years, uses that syllabus. What is he dealing with? At that time, what he is dealing with, what Westminster is dealing with, what the Orthodox Presbyterian Church is dealing with, is liberalism had reduced Christianity to simply ethics. Jesus is a good teacher, be like Jesus. And so Van Til...
So the social teachings of Christ are what's important as opposed to doctrine around divinity, soteriology, salvation.
The social teachings, but even if you reduce Christianity to merely ethics, it's, try harder to be a good person. Jesus is a good moral teacher.
Right.
And that's Protestant liberalism.
Yes.
That's what and so I think he revises it in 1941 because he's like, we need to have a lot more in here. What is the chief end of man? The thing that, you had mentioned earlier, Van Til is difficult to read. In one sense, you can read the words on the page and you can go, I kind of get what he's saying. What makes him difficult is he's making a lot of assumptions on the part of his reader. He was raised from the cradle as in the Christian Reformed Church. So the whole Dutch tradition, you know, he comes to Princeton, he comes to Westminster, he becomes a Presbyterian essentially. So he knows he knows the confessions. He knows the three forms of unity. He just assumes you know them too.
Yes.
I'm like, that's not a good assumption. And then he has a PhD in philosophy. So he's just assuming this stuff. So I think if you were alive and you were to ask him, he's like, well, I'm not being terribly original. I'm just connecting these dots here. And for the rest of us, we're going, there were dots there?
Right.
We didn't know those dots that they existed, let alone that they could be connected. You know,
that's why, by the way, just for a plug, that's why Scott Oliphant's work has been very helpful to me. And all these editions that look like this, he always writes this forward that is just very helpful to kind of give you the presuppositions that Van Til is operating on and defining terms that are just not evidently or self-evident as you read them. So,
yeah. Now, I think several of the more current editions come with a lot more explanatory information so that you can put that into perspective. And I think that's useful. You know, one of the things Oliphant does write about this in a little, you know, I think it was I have it as a booklet, but I think it was also a journal article about what he calls the methodological consistency of Van Til. And okay, again, that sounds very academic. What do we mean? Van Til's thinking doesn't really, you don't get this sense of like an early Van Til or a late Van Til like you do with other theologians. He's fairly consistent for all the time he's writing.
That is amazing. Like as I'm reading this one, I just happen to be reading this at the time I get your book, but Common Grace and the Gospel, it's a series of, is my understanding, a series of essays or journal articles or something over the course of his career. And Oliphant highlights the consistency that runs and the thread that runs throughout them. It's amazing.
I think, you know, as I started researching this, one of the reasons why he is consistent, you know, you think about what he was studying in the 1920s. One of the first papers that he writes, and he gets an award for, is on theodicy. It's the justification of God in the face of evil. And he's writing that in 1923, I think, so 5 years after the end of the First World War. Yeah, that's actually very topical, even though he never mentions the First World War. He does studies on epistemology. He's doing studies on understanding the will of man in his theological relations. He's writing on some other things, basically a critique of philosophical idealism and philosophical pragmatism. You know, ethics should be well grounded in a thorough understanding of some of these complex doctrines of the faith. And Van Til had it worked out by the time he starts at Westminster.
Wow. So
this is one of the reasons why I think, you know, even though Christian Theistic Ethics is like the only book that he published, and even that, it's a syllabus. Van Til makes the difference between syllabi, and books. And I think the key thing to remember with the syllabus is these are his lecture notes. So,
and that's important for us average people to understand, because, you know, our syllabuses when we go to college or even at the master's level tend to be just simply an outline, you know, week in and week out what your assignments are. But like these, when you talk about the syllabi of Van Til, you're talking about, like you said, lecture notes, like something substantive that you actually understand what he's going to be teaching before he teaches it, right?
Yep. And seeing some of the originals, you could see he'd make date marks on these things, which I think is like, okay, I got to this far in this lecture on February 15th, and I'll just pick it up from there and keep on lecturing. You know, so he has this basis of understanding a lot of these connections that actually become very significant when you start thinking about ethics, because people typically don't think about them. You know, a lot of books on ethics are not thinking about what the doctrine of God is. They're not thinking about how the impact of the fall on our conscience. We can acknowledge it.
Right.
Go ahead.
Is it too drastic to say, because that comment about a lot of books on ethics are not thinking about the doctrine of God, is it too strong to say that at the time Van Til writes, you're not even supposed to think about God when it comes to ethics? Like the whole philosophical shift about whether it's natural theology or whatever else, that we should be able to come to ethical pronouncements and implications just based on reason alone?
I think what has happened from the Enlightenment onwards, in the late 1600s, 1700s, you get a philosophical approach that says, we're going to come up with ethics independent of any kind of revelation. And so what they end up doing is they atomize ethics. That's why ethics gets so focused on principles and values and virtues and all of that stuff. You lose any kind of coherence to that. And so, I start the book with talking a little bit about relativism and an experience I had. I was taking a professional seminar on ethics. This wasn't a theological thing, so they had us do a value clarification exercise, which didn't actually clarify my values, but it clarified some thoughts on ethics.
Can you, before you go into that, can you help listeners understand the difference between ethics, values, and morals? How would you distinguish the three?
Values, I think, would be, they need to be subsumed under a broader understanding of ethics. I've seen some folks try to make a distinction between like ethics and mores or morals. The literature just doesn't really kind of bear out that distinction. I think, and this goes back to some of the struggles I've had with ethics even before I came to study Van Til, it becomes very atomistic. And so you come to everyone ends up having different values. They define those values in different ways.
So as from atomistic, I'm understanding you to say like people are approaching ethics as an isolated sort of field of study, disconnected or separate from others. Would that
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the problems. Even in the church, we like to say those other guys, they're relativistic, but we're not relativistic. We believe in the Bible. Okay, well, what does that mean?
I love that. I love that we think of relativism as a system, because I got this from your book. We think of relativism as a system that maybe things are relative or truth are relative. But even in systems that are like come up with hard distinctions about right and wrong, they're based on a relativism that they can determine that on their own. Would that be an accurate summary of something you paraphrase, maybe something you wrote in there?
Yeah, and one of the things with Van Til is he is vehemently against allowing autonomy, human beings to consider themselves in some way autonomous from God. And, so in terms of relativism, which values are we choosing? How do we define those values? What are the relationships and the priorities between those values? In the secular world, they can't do that. You can have your values, I can have my values. Those values are going to clash. But even in my experience in the church environment, we put ethics off to one side. Okay, we're going to have a Sunday school class on key ethical issues: abortion, pornography, homosexuality, war and peace, poverty, that kind of stuff. But we don't integrate that with any teaching that we do on sanctification. We're not putting this together we're looking at these as, okay, well, I'm going to take my values from the 10 Commandments. But the thing about Van Til, and this is one of the distinctives of his approach, if you look at the syllabus that he was using, which would be the first part of the Christian theistic ethics syllabus. That's the one he used for the better part of 30 years. He spent 60% of that thesis talking about the highest good and God being the highest good. And I was probably about 2/3 of the way through writing the thesis / the book, where it dawned on me, oh, this is what he means by Christian theistic ethics. Yeah, it's the highest good is centered on God. When you start with God as the absolute, God is not simply the absolute in terms of ethics. God is the absolute in terms of understanding reality. He's the absolute in terms of the basis for our knowledge. Therefore, it makes sense that he is also the foundation for our ethics. And not just God giving us specific values, but he has embedded those values in a covenantal narrative. You know, Van Til, he doesn't do a lot of biblical exegesis in a lot of what he writes, but he does more of it in Christian theistic ethics than he does in most of his other works. He's really spending time to kind of understand, you know, what is the normal state of man, so to speak. The normal state of man is not man in the post-fall state. The normal state of man, man as he was created. You know, God created man in a certain way. So Van Til is going through the classical thing of the four states of man. Man is fallen, man is created, man is fallen, man is redeemed, man is glorified. And using that as providing us an understanding of who man is. The book that you held up earlier about common grace and the gospel, you know, he's worked through how man changes, what that means for common grace. So he has worked through some of these ideas that are actually, when you start delving down into them, a lot of the problems that we face today in ethics and in really society are problems that go to the understanding of who man is. And
the creator-creature distinction is big for Van Til, obviously.
Yeah, and in terms of ethics, think about what is the goal of man. If we start with, I think if you were to ask even many Christians nowadays, what is the goal of the Christian life, they will talk about some kind of variant on the theme of, you know, to foster human flourishing. Okay, well, that's nice, but, you know, confessionally speaking, what is the chief end of man? I mean, you know,
that's
that
number
question.
one.
Number one on the catechism, you know, to glorify God and enjoy him forever. You know, when you start with God, it not just provides a foundation, I think it provides a cohesive understanding of how all this stuff integrates. My social ethics also are integrated with my sanctification. My sanctification is aimed towards what? It's not simply go to heaven, but it's communion with Christ, communion with our God. And so there can be an aspect here of my devotional life is also focused on this. You know, so how I behave in my ethics will affect my devotional life, will affect my sanctification, will affect how I I mean, it really comes down to the whole Christian life. I mean,
very
for me,
much.
that was my big takeaway in studying Van Til, was seeing, oh, this all comes together.
Yeah, there is a sense by which that foundation of you know, again, I said David Filson was, you know, he says it's the God of the triune God of the Bible and the Bible of the triune God as our starting points. Everything therefore flows from that, our theology, our epistemology, everything. And what I found was fascinating is you highlighted, I think it's toward the last chapter, about, you know, you talked about this consistency, both Old Testament and New Testament, not some kind of biblicist approach or one testament approach, but you referenced to, so page 147, This skewed perspective of discontinuity was a problem not only in his day, but also now. Since Van Til's death in 1987, one can see this in the contrasting titles of two contemporary books on ethics. One was Christopher J.H. Wright's Old Testament Ethics for the People of God. And then the other is Richard Hayes' The Moral Vision of the New Testament. The focus of these books is only one testament of the Bible, although neither completely excludes references to the other. But what I found fascinating about that, when you highlight Richard Hayes' The Moral Vision, and you also talk about sort of the relativism that these schemes come about. Well, I don't know. Have you seen Richard Hayes' latest book, The Widening of God's Mercy, Sexuality Within the Biblical Story?
I have not seen that, no.
Oh, look it up. This is kind of hit all over social media now, because essentially Richard Hayes has rejected the traditional biblical sexual ethic. And I didn't know this about the work you're citing here as a New Testament Christian ethic. So again, we're going to disregard the Old Testament, and this is this New Testament only, this Christian ethic of Jesus Christ. And essentially, one of the promotional reviews of this book says, if the Bible shows us a God who changes his mind, they say perhaps Christians should do the same. So here you put this in the book, published, that you wrote a few years ago, just recently published, and now sort of the taken to its logical end is a changing of the view of sexual ethics, because of course Jesus loved the sinner. I assume. I haven't read Hayes' new book, but
yeah, this is the problem, I think, with atomism. I've wondered. I hadn't heard about Hayes, but I've seen other theologians, especially in the last 10 years, who, you would have considered them sound evangelical conservative theologians, and then on issues of sexuality, they've just kind of flipped. Now, on a personal level, you can understand that they may be changing their views because, family members came out as gay or what have you. But how do you rationalize that as a theologian? But if you're taking the view that, well, we just have this list of to-dos, list of values, virtues, then if they're decontextualized, you can redefine them. And that's what they end up doing. And, I think one of the things about Van Til's approach, that if you start getting into issues of, if you're confronted, for example, with the idea that my change on this issue is actually going to reflect or foster a change in the understanding of who God is away from a biblical thing, then that becomes a much higher threshold that maybe you ought to rethink what you're doing. I think, for example, and speaking from a PCA perspective, we've wrestled with the whole revoice thing over the last few years. I think we've come to a good place. I would have preferred something more conservative, but okay. I think we're in a relatively good place with that. But what strikes me as interesting is in the arguments that have been done really in the last couple of years, we're getting more into the, hey, wait a minute, we're not just talking about, is this consistent with what the Bible teaches on sexuality? There's a recognition of, if what the side B folks were saying, side B gay Christianity folks were saying is true, then God made people a certain way that is contradictory to what he says that they have to live by, and he can't do anything to change them.
Well, that's something, as I have written pretty extensively on this, but in my own blog, of course, but picked up by other sources, is it is not simply a language thing like many in the PCA like to say. It is very much an ontological and anthropological issue, and it speaks again of creator, creature, what is the nature of man, and it is theological in nature, which is what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fundamentally, you're getting into certain assumptions about the doctrine of God. And, if we started with looking at some of these issues of what does this mean for the doctrine of God, then that may actually be more of a break, more of a conservative, practical anchor for our ethics than starting with, oh, well, there are a bunch of these values, and here are the values that we're going to emphasize, and here's how we're going to define those values. I mean, that's where you get into the relativism. And if you're starting with the doctrine of man, and again, going back to what Van Til is talking about, I think Van Til is right. Man in the quote-unquote normal state, is man as he was created, man as God intended him to be, which means that there is a telos, there is a goal that man is being moved towards, because we have fallen from that. So it's a restoration of sorts, but it also is a culmination with our communion with God. There's a real difference between the is and the ought. And I think that's important for us nowadays, because what in the research that I was doing, just trying to understand ethics and Van Til's place in this, what I see is ethics in the secular sense has been largely replaced. People will talk about ethics. Secular folks will still talk about ethics. But they talk about it, it's really kind of collapsed into psychology. And so you're not, there is less and less of a, we ought to be a certain way, and more simply, well, this is just the way people are. And so therefore the is becomes the normative. And that's what, Christianity, and in a full orbed sense, is talking about God didn't just create the world and all things in it, and in a physical sense, he infused that with a moral order. And so there's an apologetic aspect to this, that I think is going to be increasingly clear as we are living in, what Aaron Renn calls the negative world. It's, we have an understanding of reality that is not just an accumulation of different values and virtues. We understand reality fundamentally different than the way most people do nowadays.
Well, you know what's amazing? So not just that this sort of shift in Richard Hayes, but I don't know if you saw recently what Richard Dawkins said about, he considers himself a cultural Christian, and he's speaking of that in ethical terms. Now, we would always, we don't want to be cultural Christians as Christians, but his point was, he said, I love hymns and Christmas carols, and I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. I feel that we are a Christian country in that sense. And he appreciates, suddenly he appreciates the Christian ethic that values and honors women and other races and gives dignity to them, because he sees what the Islamic shift in Great Britain is doing to that country. And of course, Richard Dawkins is one of the new atheists who he's wants to rid the world of religion, including Christianity, but he likes the ethics that Christianity has brought in, and he sees the shift into this negative world as a negative thing, actually. It's just a fascinating admission by him.
I had heard about that. It is both fascinating and ironic, given where he's coming from.
Yeah. He wants to live in a culturally Christian country, he says. That's a quote.
I think this is one aspect of ethics that is lost with a lot of the way that we approach things in this very atomistic ways. There is a vision for the ethical life, biblically understood. And I think, to put it in more academic terms, Van Til is doing narrative ethics 50 years before anyone even coined the term. The narrative is the biblical narrative, and that provides a coherence to our understanding of ethics.
Isn't it, by the way, isn't it interesting, and you highlighted this in your book, that sounds very postmodern, but it's not, because, while the postmodern context is very much about narrative, it's about your own personal narrative. But Van Til is talking about the grand narrative of Scripture, is he not? Yeah. The story of redemption, creation, redemption, who God is, who we are in him, and where we're going.
And that overarching, that narrative, that meta-narrative, people want something to live by. They want something that gives their life meaning. And if ethics is simply reduced to, here's a list of do's and don'ts, then that kind of, you lose the story. People want to find themselves in the story. They want to be part of this bigger story. And as Christians, we have that. We have that not simply in a story that somebody has made up. We have that in the historical unfolding of God's redemptive program.
Praise God.
And in the full narrative of Scripture, Van Til is doing both a biblical theology. When I teach this, biblical theology is what gives us the vision of what God is doing, the overarching vision. Systematic theology helps us get the details right. Van Til's doing both of these things, and there's a depth there when you start plumbing it. Of this is how it's something that a sophisticated theologian is not going to mine the depths of, but at the same time, a child can understand it as well.
Yeah. So, how would you most succinctly put this whole conversation? Like, how would you describe how Van Til's project, how his Christian ethics differs from the other world systems? And I know you go through certain theologians, but I'm just talking more broadly. For somebody listening to this, we really haven't gotten to rubber meets the road. Now we have started with the foundation of God, but then how does our right notion of God and the creator creature distinction play out in rubber meets the road ethics?
A few things I would say, just kind of sum up. There's a conceptual theological level of the takeaway of Van Til's approach, and then there's practical level. So on the conceptual and the theological level, his approach, I think, meshes with the confession. It is covenantal, so it's something that we can draw on in other aspects of our life. There's a depth to it. There's a coherence to it. It rightly situates the role that conscience plays, because as Reformed Christians, we understand the fall meant something. And conscience is not the overarching guide in the way that it is in other systems. On the other hand, on a practical level, there's a conservative aspect to this. Like I was talking about earlier, if you have to change the doctrine of God in order to justify what your sexuality, then you're messing with something a lot more complicated, and that should be a deterrent to you. There's a real difference in terms of what the endpoint is of how we're living. There's a balance between in how we live. In this atomistic way, we tend to fixate on certain values and become legalist about them, and then ignore other values. But if you have that coherence that Van Til is pointing to, then you have this balance between a kind of antinomianism and a legalism. There's an apologetic aspect to this. And I would also say there's a counseling aspect. So let me take those in order. In terms of an apologetic aspect, understand, bringing this kind of whole theology approach that Van Til has, as we're dealing with the challenges of our day and age, if you recognize this ethics is more than just the accumulation of values, then as we're looking at how we deal with diversity, equity, inclusion issues, for example, you start realizing the Christian view is not just different, but how can we defend that to people as this is actually a better good for us. This is really coming to the fore in a lot of issues on sexuality. As we teach this in our churches, there's been a tendency over the years to just tell folks, it's almost a legalistic approach. Try to obey these laws without giving folks a real sense of this is what the significance of that means in a broader scope of things.
Well, when we brought up the side B revoice issue before of like this gay identity, which becomes defining rather than descriptive, and I had written a piece called "The Joy Robbing False Hope of Side B Gay Christianity," because if you grant to somebody, this is who you are, this is what you are, it becomes the depth of legalism to say, then just don't do this. This is what you are, but don't do it. Don't live out what you are. It's hopeless. It's sad. I can't give that to a youth in my church. Yeah, that's what you are. And the best you can hope for is to struggle against this your whole life and hope to not do it. But a right conception of what the nature of man is and who God is says, no, that's not what you are. It is a real experience, a real desire, but that's not what and who you are,
Exactly. And there's a counseling aspect to this as well. Well, let me share a story here. Years ago, I was moving out of the Virginia area briefly. I had some friends from college who lived down in the southern part of the state. So I was like, before I go, I want to touch base, visit with you guys. They said, welcome, come on down. Before you walk in the door, here's what we're struggling with. The wife was 6 months pregnant, and they had known for 3 months that the baby was developing in a way that would not have a brain. So when the baby would be born, she would be, if not stillborn, then probably dead within hours. This couple knew that 6 months out.
I have a cousin that went through this. It was so humbling watching them walk it out.
This is where people in their church were going, okay, we're typically against abortion, but maybe this is where abortion is good. And my friends were like, hey, listen, God gave us this gift. God can take away. He will sustain us. Some days are good days. Some days are bad days. But we're not going to abort this child. And, in that way, they were actually able to minister to other people. And so, what was the summum bonum? It was to honor God. Not in some legalistic thing, but, this is where understanding that the summum bonum, the highest good, is communion with God, is to follow Christ, actually is a very practical thing. Because if ethics is simply how we can get human flourishing, then when you're not flourishing in that way, you're like ready to redefine what your ethics are or what your beliefs are. But if you understand that the highest good is to follow God, then even in the midst of suffering, your ethics and your hold. And I think that's a really important thing.
Wow, that is so profound, because in our day, and again, even in our own denomination, where this idea of human flourishing is becomes so prominent and the driving sort of factor, and almost becomes synonymous with God's will. How does that really take into account suffering? And when I watch my cousins go through that same thing, and I think their child lived a couple hours, and they knew, like you said, for 6 months. And even parts of me who is strongly pro-life, I'm like, I can see why people would want to support abortion in this case, and yet I can't get there. But I don't know how these people are doing it right now. And what it really showed me was the preciousness of life, the sanctity of life, that life is not defined by how we want to define flourishing or anything else. And to these people, this was their child, and they were going to love their child, and they were going to trust God in a seemingly hopeless situation. And I know it's changed them in remarkable ways toward their own sanctification. And so I think that's a beautiful example. You talk about that right from the beginning, about how people typically reconsider their beliefs when tripped up over matter of behavior, and in many cases leave the faith either altogether or for another tradition, or they redefine now what. So circumstances will change what we know to be true if we let it. And I think what Van Til gives us is, we can plant our flag in what is true, and then try to view it through the lens of God, And I think of two other contemporary cases. One is Andy Stanley back almost a year ago or last fall, where he is, saying on the one hand, very, very postmodern of him, like he still upholds a biblical sexual ethic, but for LGBTQIA plus people, this is the closest they'll get to a biblical marriage. And so we're just going to love them. And, we say, well, man, that's Andy Stanley. So hosting now seminars and all this to include practicing people who overtly practice against a biblical sexual ethic and receive them in as full members of the church, and we're there to support these decisions. And we think, well, that's Andy Stanley. But then, you had the Alistair Begg thing a couple months ago now. And I'm not one, I don't want to cancel Alistair, but like his whole rationale in the first time it came up was, well, we don't want to appear intolerant. And I said, man, I'm sympathetic to a grandmother or a parent like that immediate of a family to, there's things on the ground going on that are affecting their relationship with their kid. And this could be the last straw where they lose relationship with their child. I'm sympathetic to their pull to go to the wedding, but the reason to go, and I'm not telling you, I would never advise to go, but it is absolutely not what Alistair said. Well, you don't want to appear intolerant, because we don't determine ethics by how it appears. We determine what is the right course of action by what is right and honoring to God, and what attendance actually does communicate. And so I do think like experience, like when you pastorally have that person in your office, and you're a ruling elder, you're dealing with pastoral concerns. I think this to me gets to the difference between values, and if there is a difference between morals and ethics, but values and ethics, in that ethics is boots on the ground. You may have like the value may be to uphold life and promote justice, but the situation is how it plays out. It plays out in how that ethic lives itself out. And it is hard. And if we're not rooted and grounded in something bigger than our own circumstances, we are going to compromise.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, let me see where else we want to go. We're kind of rounding the bend on this. What do you want to highlight as part of this conversation? This book was published very recently. I might actually get this podcast out before Reformed Forum gets theirs out, and that'll be fun for me if I do. So you'll be promoting this in other ways. What are some other takeaways that you would like to communicate on this discussion?
I think we've hit the highlights of the stuff that I had written down that I wanted to get across. I mean, for me, obviously, this is my first book. This is first thing on ethics. I'm not going to say that I've read everything on ethics. It's a vast field. It's very, because it's so atomistic, there's just a lot of debate and dissension. For me, I found that studying Van Til's approach to this actually really strengthened. It forced me to go back and understand who God is. And it forced me, and in doing that, that has just revolutionized, I would say, my ministry. Coming back to the doctrine of God and how great a God he is, and that he is unchanging. I'm in more awe of God now than I was years ago. And I would not have expected to have gotten that out of a study of Van Til's ethics, but that is one of the things that I'm hoping that if someone reads the book, I hope they get a better understanding of Van Til the man, a better understanding of biblical ethics, and a better foundation. But if you come away with a better understanding of who God is and just how he is the foundation for our reality, our knowing, and our behavior, then, glory be to him.
Praise God. Again, I mentioned David Filson, and he gave me the same sense. And so that something good is going on there at Westminster, Philly, with Oliphant and Edgar, right? William Edgar was part of your...
Bill Edgar was my advisor. He was a great encouragement to me. I did have a class with Oliphant, but Edgar was really walking with me on a lot of this stuff, and I think he's now retired. He's just a great servant of God.
Yeah. But the point is, and we think of Van Til as sort of this heady, presuppositional, like just rigid, I don't care what you think, I'm going to presuppose God in Scripture. But when you understand how that foundation, everything flows from it. And back to the beginning of this, like, I couldn't read and study Van Til without seeing the ethical implications. And so I'm glad that through your work, and it seems like there's going to be more work coming out on it just in my own research, that we're going to see the broader implications rather than some kind of intellectual exercise of apologetics, which it's not. Rightly understood, being Van Tilian has it changes lives through, again, that appreciation for who God is. And let me just give you some encouragement. So as a when I read Van Til, and I've read a few of his works. I'm reading Common Grace right now. I've read In Defense of the Faith. I've read his book on apologetics, or at least parts of it. I always have to brace myself to get in a Van Tilian mind of how he's going to use certain terms and what he really means by these and that. And man, you're a great writer. And you take there's an academic side to this, but there's also a pastoral side to this, and it's also written in such a way that I think almost anybody could understand it. And so that would be an encouragement to anybody hearing this. Scott does a great job of helping you understand what's going on here in a way that very much rubber meets the road and speaks to the heart. And so kudos on that, Scott.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, I guess we've landed the plane. Tell Porter I said hi.
Will do.
Saw him last week at Twin Lakes Fellowship, and he said he was excited for this interview. And so Porter's become a friend in our circles, and I'm sure will I see you at GA?
Yep, I'm planning on going to GA.
It's close by, right?
Yeah, it's in Richmond. So
yeah.
It'll take as long to get to Richmond as it will to fly to Birmingham or Memphis. Traffic being what it is, it'll take an hour to get to Fredericksburg, and then 2 hours to get to Fredericksburg, even though it's 20 miles away.
Yeah. So do you know Matt Fender?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. He's a ruling elder outside of Richmond, and he's obsessed with Van Til. He teaches apologetics based on Van Til to youth, to the congregation. So he's a ruling elder. He'll be at GA. You two should connect. You heard it here first. Well, good stuff, Scott. I appreciate you. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for blowing with me, especially through some of the technical issues we had earlier. So
we got through them. I don't even think they'll be noticed here. So that's great. You're welcome.
So thanks for having me on. I very much appreciate it. And thanks for the encouragement.